Well, it's good to see Philadelphia's transit budget crisis has been kind of resolved. It may not be the way we wanted it to, and it's got a lot of problems, but at least SEPTA's got funding to make it through the next 2 years. Yeah, it's fine. I can take my train into the city, take some interesting pictures, go to transit advocacy meetings, work on some long-term projects, a nice, relaxing day.
Can you please stop giving me crises to yell about all the time, SEPTA? I swear we can't have anything nice in this city anymore.
Just when we all thought the crisis with SEPTA couldn't get more unhinged, we now have one of the biggest and most dramatic stories surrounding public transport in America this year, period. And it has to do with a topic of a previous video on this channel, no less. It's these things. The venerable, long-lasting, or ancient if you want to be less charitable, Silverliner 4 electric multiple units, the 50-year-old workhorses of SEPTA's regional rail network. While I am more than willing to admit the thumbnail of that one video was a bit clickbaity at the time, it actually turned out to be pretty prophetic. 2 years after that video comes out, and now the Silverliner 4s are not only falling apart at the seams, they have been catching on fire 5 times in 8 months. And as a result, it has put the agency in a bind that seems to be harder to escape from than some. And with long-term solutions not to be seen for years, leaving some to question if SEPTA's regional rail operations can be sustainable for now. So, let's see what has happened, what is happening to provide a solution, and if indeed some of the oldest trains in America can survive these next few years, and not take the transportation system of one of America's largest cities down with them as they start to fade out. February 6th, 2025. A chilly winter's day with weather just above freezing. It's getting close to 6 p.m., and SEPTA train number 3223, made up of 6 Silverliner 4 electric multiple unit cars built in the mid-1970s, is running a local service on the Wilmington-Newark line and is approaching Crumlin Station in Ridley Park, Pennsylvania. The journey thus far has not been a smooth one. About 2 hours prior, the previous engineer of the train reported to SEPTA's dispatchers that the train was performing very sluggishly, and that a fault light indicator had come on in the cab. Think of something like a check engine light on a car for something similar. About an hour before the incident, just before the train was about to pass through Center City, Philadelphia, the engineer noticed a burning smell in the lead car of the train, car number 132, part of a married pair set of coaches built for the Reading Company in 1974. However, despite the issues, the dispatcher ordered the train to continue regardless. It's the rush hour, and fault lights mostly come on for minor reasons anyway. It could be inspected when the train got back to the depot that night. However, as the train continued, it continued to fall behind schedule due to the sluggish acceleration. As it turned out, 3 of the 6 cars of the train, all of which are powered on these kinds of trains, were not getting enough power to the traction motors to move the train at its normal pace, one of which was car number 132. But more ominously, the burning smell persisted. As the train left Ridley Park Station bound for its next stop down the line at Crumlin, the engineer finally saw smoke emerge into the cab of the lead car. And as we all know, where there's smoke, there's fire. He was able to bring the train safely to a stop at Crumlin Station, by which point the passengers knew something was wrong too. The crew worked quickly to get everybody out, and all 4 crew and 325 passengers were able to evacuate the train safely before car 132 fully caught fire. Starting from the bottom of the car body, the flames reached the main body, igniting seats and paneling in the interior before finally reaching the car's roof. This was the state it was in when fire trucks and ambulances arrived to put out the blaze and tend to the injured, which thankfully were only 4 minor injuries. Car number 132, however, was burned beyond repair by the time the fire was put out, and has sat derelict in Overbrook Yard to this day. Almost immediately, this incident would make news, and the age of the trains quickly became a talking point amongst those who were local to the Philly area. With these trains just passing their 50th birthday a couple of years ago, much older than almost any other kind of train still in service in the US, even for a country that's known for running old trains, the age quickly became speculated as to an underlying factor as to the fire. But in order to find out for sure, the incident scene saw a visit from the top investigative body for such an incident, the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB. You probably know them as the investigators in the majority of episodes of shows like Air Crash Investigation or Mayday, or Seconds from Disaster if you're a real G. And very quickly, the NTSB would get to work. The official full report is yet to be complete as of this writing, but the preliminary findings were released, and they found that the fire was caused by overheating electrical components in the train's propulsion system. This was a very serious case indeed, but the hope was that it was just a one-off. There was a previous incident of fire on the Silverliner 4s back in 2018, but that was in 2018. That was 7 years ago. So there really wasn't much certainty if this was a one-off or the start of something more troubling. Oh, how little we actually knew back then. June 3rd, 2025, 4 months later. It's 7:10 a.m. on a much more pleasant morning that would give way to a warmer day. Very much so in one regard at least. This morning would see SEPTA train 7206, made up of 5 Silverliner 4 cars, arrive at Levittown Station on the Trenton line bound for Center City. Levittown is the first stop on the line out from Trenton, but thus far, things have been smooth. No fault lights, not too many performance worries, maybe a tad sluggish, but nothing unusual for these aging cars. But as the train pulled into the platform at Levittown, that quickly changed, as while the train sat at the platform, car number 442, the last car in the train, caught fire as well, starting at the top of the car. Once again, the crew reacted quickly and were able to successfully evacuate all 150 passengers and crew safely with no injuries. The Levittown Fire Department was able to quickly put out the blaze before it could have damaged the car's interior, and they were so effective in fact that the car was able to be fixed and put back into service. As part of the investigation into the Crumlin fire, the NTSB looked into this incident as well, and while both of them were fire incidents, there was a key difference found between them. The Crumlin fire started at the bottom of the car where the traction power equipment was. This one, however, started at the top of the car, in the streamlined bump on the roof where the dynamic brake systems are, and that's where this fire got its start. It was found that part of the control system for the dynamic brakes had failed, and the pressure switch that shuts off the dynamic brakes failed as well, which led to the dynamic brakes being on while the train was still moving at speed on one of the fastest parts of the SEPTA network. This in turn would cause them to overheat and catch fire. The two fires were already disturbing, despite the small casualty count from both of these incidents. But the fact that the fires were caused for two different reasons was perhaps more worrying. These trains were already exhibiting issues in one area, and now they had issues in another one too? Surely this can't get worse, right? July 22nd, 2025, nearly 2 months after the Levittown incident. And on this warm summer's night just before 11 p.m., SEPTA train 3553 was running an outbound local service on the Paoli-Thorndale line out to Malvern. In the 2 hours prior, 2 different crews had run this train, made up of 6 Silverliner 4s, and both of them have reported a fault light appearing in the cab, very much like the Crumlin incident. And also much like with Crumlin, the crew reported the train was accelerating sluggishly. But also like in Crumlin's case, the train was told by dispatch to continue, particularly since the train could be inspected immediately after this run at Fraser Yard just past Malvern Station. But then, as the train arrived at Paoli Station, the second to last stop of the night, the train lost power, and one of the conductors headed towards the back of the train to help reset it. And as he walked into car number 114, the 5th of 6 cars in the train, he found it on fire. There were only 14 people aboard the train, all of whom were quickly evacuated, with the only injury being to the conductor, who was taken to hospital to be treated for smoke inhalation. The Paoli Fire Department was quickly on the scene and put the blaze out, but like Car 132 at Crumlin, Car 114 was damaged beyond repair and is also sat derelict in Overbrook Yard. The NTSB had yet another case to check over, and they found that this fire was caused by overheating electrical components in the traction equipment, just like at Crumlin. 3 fires in 6 months, 2 of them with the same cause. This was certainly a serious problem that SEPTA had on their hands, but with the Silverliner 4s making up 2/3 of SEPTA's entire regional rail fleet, a mass withdrawal would be disastrous for the agency and the city. It was after this that SEPTA started to make movements to mitigate these issues. On July 25th, 3 days after the Paoli fire, SEPTA's mechanical division put out the notice that any train was to be taken out of service immediately if the crew notices many of the same things that the crews experienced in the 3 incidents, from dynamic brake malfunctions, electrical faults recurring after system resets, repeated circuit breaker trips, multiple cars of a train showing electrical faults, and of course, smoke in the cab. It was a measure meant to get a hold of the problem and work with the NTSB towards a remedy to keep the trains going. After all, there was no cavalry coming over the hill for these trains yet. SEPTA was only just now working with getting the specs for the replacement cars the Silverliner 6s arranged, and they would be years away even if the contract was signed then. These trains needed to be preserved, and this was on top of SEPTA's budget crisis that it was also facing at this time as well. It seemed like SEPTA was hitting rock bottom with all the crises they were dealing with. There were a lot of metaphorical fires alongside these real ones. And then add one more to the pile. September 23rd, 2025, 2 months after the Paoli incident. It's 4:45 p.m. and SEPTA train number 3592, made up of 6 Silverliner 4 cars, is running an express service on the Lansdale-Doylestown line bound for Doylestown, and is about to arrive on its first stop out from the city all the way out at Fort Washington. Thus far, the express run had been mostly smooth, but as the train was approaching Fort Washington Station, one of the conductors saw smoke coming from the roof of the 5th car in the train, car number 442. Wait a minute. 442? Why does that number sound familiar? Oh right, it's the exact same car that caught fire in the Levittown incident. It's fortunate that the crew discovered the problem when they did, as the train was arriving at Fort Washington, since they were able to evacuate everyone quickly as soon as they arrived. And even more remarkable, of the 4 crew and 350 passengers, there were no injuries reported. It's at this point it must be said that the lack of serious injuries in any of these incidents truly is a testament to the skill, care, and professionalism of the SEPTA crews. Had it not been for them and their quick thinking, these incidents could have been much worse. But even still, this was a bridge too far. The NTSB was getting close to releasing the decisive report on what SEPTA and the FRA, the Federal Railroad Administration, were to do regarding this problem. And this fire was really showing how dire it was to take action. Everyone was bracing themselves for what the plan of action would be to finally get the nightmare over and done with, even if it meant more pain for all in the short term. And when the NTSB got their hands on car 442, they found that rather than the same causes at Levittown, which was dynamic brakes overheating and failing, this time it was electrical components near the dynamic brakes, which were replaced after the Levittown incident. Presumably, the rush to get this car back into service led to a repair defect that led to this second fire on the car. While by this point SEPTA's operating budget problems have been temporarily resolved with a 2-year stopgap solution, the nature of it pilfering the capital budget of SEPTA just to keep the metaphorical lights on would in all likelihood hurt the timeline of getting replacements. An answer was needed to keep these trains going desperately. And then... September 25th, 2025. 2 days later. Yes, 2 days after the Fort Washington incident, It happened again. It was just past 7 a.m. and SEPTA train 705 had just set off from Chestnut Hill East Station on, well, the Chestnut Hill East line for the early morning run to Center City. This train, made up of 5 Silverliner 4s, had been reportedly running since the previous day with a fault light appearing, but presumably because the train had not yet exhibited any of the symptoms that SEPTA said to withdraw the train for, the train was kept in service. But almost immediately, and I mean immediately, problems arose as the train arrived at its first stop about a minute down the line at Graver Station. Fire was spotted coming from the bottom of car number 396, the second car in the train that day. All 29 passengers and crew were promptly and effectively evacuated at Graver Station with no injuries, and the crew actually managed to catch the blaze early this time, and one of the conductors put the fire out themselves with a handheld fire extinguisher. With this one being so recent, the cause is not fully published yet, but the NTSB did find that this time the fire started in one of the traction motors, which are attached to the wheel axles of the cars, and therefore this makes it more akin to the Crumlin and Paoli fires rather than the dynamic brake-related incidents at the Levittown and Fort Washington fires. By this point, enough was enough, and on September 30th, the NTSB released their action report. And it was indeed drastic. In the report, which released the preliminary findings of the investigations into the 5 incidents and was an invaluable source for this video, the NTSB was unsparing in what they recommended SEPTA and the FRA do. Withdraw the Silverliner 4s from service and get to the bottom of why these fires were happening. Now. And the very next day, it would go into effect. October 1st would see the FRA force SEPTA to take most of the Silverliner 4s out of service and line them up for a new inspection routine to go over the areas of them that seemed to be where the fires came from. And the schedule for doing so was tight. The Silverliner 4s needed to be out of service for as short a time as possible so that they could supplement the remaining Silverliner 5s and Comic Car push-pull sets, all of which were forced to run short formations just to maintain some kind of service frequency that were normally run on the network. And by short formations, I mean 2-car sets being the norm across all lines, especially in off-peak hours. Normally, SEPTA trains are between 4 and 6 cars on most lines for reference. It quickly turned into another case of SEPTA-geddon, where riders would have crowded trains constantly, if they showed up at all. But with few other kinds of equipment available, this was what had to be put up with. The first few weeks, the inspections would go slowly, as the maintenance staff were being trained on the new inspection techniques that the FRA required. This may have been expected, but it was not good for SEPTA, since the FRA and the US DOT had set a deadline of November 1st for the inspections. 30 days to inspect all 223 cars, using new procedures that had to be taught to them at scale. That was worrying, and it even led to speculation that this was a case of political shenaniganry on part of the US DOT, with the current Secretary of Transportation, Sean Duffy, being singled out particularly. But while the political rhetoric went back and forth, the SEPTA crews were getting quicker and quicker at performing these inspections. But as the month progressed, it was becoming increasingly unlikely that SEPTA would come anywhere close to this deadline. And pretty quickly, SEPTA's leadership, led by their newly minted general manager Scott Sauer, who took the top role in early June replacing the retiring Leslie Richards, looked for answers. While it could be easily described that Sauer was thrown out of the frying pan and into the fire in many ways when he took this role, what with the budget crisis, labor negotiations, and now this, having worked with the agency for decades, even starting out his career as a trolley operator, he would certainly be seen as better suited to the task than many others that they can name. Sauer quickly realized that the deadline would not be met, and in mid-October, he began to work with the FRA and the US DOT to have the deadline extended. In the midst of all this, I actually saw Scott Sauer testify before a committee of Philadelphia's City Council to check in on how things were going. Alongside the cost-saving measures to not overextend the now depleted capital funding of the agency from Pennsylvania's Transit Trust Fund, a situation you can learn about in my rambling videos on the matter here, such as holding off on new orders for buses for the time being, Sauer's testimony gave me some hope for a return to normalcy in the future and a better understanding of what SEPTA was doing. First was the extension of their inspection deadline, which was granted to see the deadline go from November 1st to November 14th, which proved to be just the amount of time they needed, with the last inspection being complete, on the Penn Central Heritage car no less, a day early on November 13th.
Oh, great. So we're back to normal, right?
No, not even close. Sauer then elaborated on what comes after the inspections are done. The FRA has now required that SEPTA install new fire detection equipment on all the cars that would shut the train down if overheating is detected, so that such incidents can be prevented altogether or caught early if all else fails, like at Gravers. SEPTA now has until December 5th to fit this equipment to the cars, and thus far I haven't heard too much worry that they'll miss this deadline. In fact, the day this goes live is the day after the deadline, so I will put a note here about whether they were successful or not. But even with the comprehensive inspections and the new safety equipment being installed, the underlying problem with the trains still remain, in that they're 50-year-old trains that never saw a true refurbishment program in their lives, and it's far too late to meaningfully start a refurb program at this rate. The obvious solution is to just get new trains, which SEPTA has wanted to do for a while. In fact, 2 years ago, I made a video about this topic, particularly after SEPTA released an initial request for information and a technical spec sheet for what they wanted for a next-generation electric mobile unit, the Silverliner 6. However, that ROI was removed from SEPTA's public website in mid-2024 where it would be reworked, presumably after input from builders. However, those of you familiar with SEPTA's situation, or those of you paying attention earlier, probably have a big question rattling around in your head. SEPTA's capital budget was demolished by the budget crisis that public transit in PA is going through as a short-term measure to keep the agency going. Where in the world would they get this money from? This was recognized by the city council members who Sauer testified to, and in the testimony, he brought up something that would serve the role just as well. The U.S. Department of Transportation has a special program to offer a transit agency special low-interest loans to go towards replacing transit equipment that is well and truly on its last legs. And considering the situation at hand, Sauer and SEPTA staff seem confident that they would qualify for such loans. So that will go on to cover the capital costs of getting new trains for the most part. And Sauer also mentioned that he expected that the official request for proposal going out to builders of the Silverliner 6s would be released later this year. And I can confirm they kept that promise, because here is the request for proposal right here on their website. It came out to the public about 2 weeks after that meeting, even though it was officially completed in September. And in its 1,500 pages, which I basically skim-read or picked through the parts I thought would give the biggest clues as to what the new trains would be like, even I'm not crazy enough to read it word for word, and picking out some of the important points that I looked for, in a way, a prediction of mine from my video 2 years ago may have been reinforced. The specifications are giving pretty big Metro North M8 or Long Island Railroad M9 energy, which are very successful trains serving the New York City area, which coincidentally have a new variant being built for Metro North's third rail Hudson and Harlem lines, the M9A, to be built by, oh, bonjour, Alstom. Possible Alstom Avelia Liberty-induced stress disorder notwithstanding, the M8s and M9s are a very good basis to be building a modern commuter train around, and would comfortably meet SEPTA's needs for 125 two-car married pair sets that SEPTA has put out the request for, making for 250 Silverliner 6 cars to replace the 233 Silverliner 4s. That said, it's not the only way they could go with this one, with another purported option that was brought up by Alan Fisher on Twitter was a purported Northeast Corridor spec variant of probably everybody's favorite commuter train in the world, the Stadler Flirt, which I think most people would love to see SEPTA pick, if only Flirts didn't tend to be more expensive than most.
However, a flirt or something else that's built around a more modern framework rather than one that, while indeed effective, is still very much a product of the outdated standards pre-2015 of America that needs to be put in the past, would be by far the best option to go for if SEPTA actually wants to reach the network performance it aspires to. And if you want more of a breakdown of what SEPTA ought to go for, definitely check out a link in the description to read the post of 15-Minute Railroad on Substack by Alejandro Gonzalez for a very in-depth explainer on what is really needed to be looked into, and what SEPTA is still doing wrong here.
In the end, it's something that remains to be seen, but it does mean that there is a pathway out of the dark ages of using trains that were new around the time of the bicentennial for SEPTA, and could be the start of much better things for the agency. That being said, however, it will take a while, since the anticipated cost of the contract would be around $1 billion, and the timeline would see the first cars arrive in the early 2030s, with full replacement complete by 2035 at earliest. Understandably for many, that hope seems very far away indeed. What with crowded short trains, which will likely persist into the start of the new year, even with coaches being borrowed from the MARC commuter rail system in Maryland, it's become clear that this year is a pivotal moment for SEPTA. And in the process, there have been two common culprits that has been cited by the public as the real cause, quote unquote, of why SEPTA has been in this position of having to run 50-year-old trains for as long as they have. One argument lays the blame solely on the fact that SEPTA's lack of a comprehensive funding model and the bureaucratic and legal nonsense that has surrounded SEPTA at the state and local levels is the sole reason as to why SEPTA is forced into this position. They've been constantly cited as the most efficient large transit agency in the country when it comes to carrying passengers per dollar in subsidies, so they've been doing what they can with table scraps. The other argument lays the blame squarely at the agency's management, particularly since SEPTA has not always had the fortune of being blessed with people who have had the will to see big positive changes happen. And it is shown in how the services and the equipment has been said to deteriorate, with a friend of mine who works in the passenger rail business on the Northeast Corridor saying that SEPTA has consistently had the worst maintenance standards of any of the commuter rail operators on the NEC for a few years, so management can't be let off the hook. But here's the ultimate thing. Neither of these causes are mutually exclusive. In the end, it's really both. SEPTA is very much a case where funding constraints, restrictive laws and bylaws, and a severely flawed leadership structure, particularly in the political hires that don't use transit that much that make up the board of directors, have been a core cause as to the lackluster leadership in recent years, many of whom have never had experience working in the public transit sector before they took the top job at SEPTA. I'm looking right at Leslie Richards in this case, try as she might have to do some things. And this has rubbed off on staff, with a friend of mine within SEPTA describing the situation as having been caused by indirect neglect and a lack of urgency when it comes to resolving issues with the Fords when they cropped up in their later years. Because things like fault lights happen so often, and many of them were for far less serious reasons, a lot of the problems were treated as aging quirks rather than safety issues. That is, until now. This has definitely not been helped by the fact that because the original builders of the trains, General Electric, Avco, and Bud, either don't make trains anymore or don't exist as companies, replacement parts need to be custom made and are therefore more expensive and in short supply. This speaks to the relative neglect of the regional rail system in general by both management and government, particularly the state government, which is sadly not exclusive to regional rail, but other areas of public transit. But as the old saying goes, even a broken clock is right twice a day, and SEPTA's new GM hire in Scott Sauer may be the best suited GM SEPTA has had in a while. Having someone familiar with all facets of the agency over the course of his career, Sauer has the career experience needed, and he has been putting it to good use so far. And perhaps as important, he's making sure the public can see it, being probably the best communicator of a GM SEPTA has had, maybe ever. There's a lot that he and the management team need to tackle, and it's still early days. But what's as important as resolving the issues is making sure the public sees it, and Sauer seems to get that. and having started to make replacements in the ineffective management of various departments, including rail maintenance, it's definitely a sign that SEPTA is not going to bury its head in the sand this go around. And this is alongside recent news that came about on the day I recorded this voiceover, where Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro has directed $220 million in state funding aid to cover the upgrade work and the backup rail cars from MARC, among other things. It may be at a low point now, especially with a certain other issue on the horizon in the city transit division related to the evergreen SEPTA problem of labor relations. But sometimes, you might need to hit rock bottom to find some foundation, and regroup, reform into something stronger, and tackle the future. And considering some of the people I've had the opportunity to talk about with such matters, I think there's a better chance at making SEPTA as truly great as it can be than a lot of cynical Philadelphians think. Plus, even with these incidents, taking the train, trolley, or the bus in Philly is a lot safer than driving. By nature. And I mean a lot safer. I mean, seriously, have you seen people drive on Roosevelt Boulevard? That's the real fight for your survival in this city. And plus, hey, you don't have to incur the wrath of the PPA if you breathe wrong while you're paying for parking. Should be pretty obvious. Philadelphia's transit system is undoubtedly in the midst of one of the most chaotic times that it has seen in the entire 60-plus year existence of the Southeastern Pennsylvania Transportation Authority. It's one that has been seeing problems crop up from all directions, from labor disputes to a threatened loss of funding to the monkey's paw funding model it's been saddled with for now. The last thing it needed was a problem as serious as the trains that its riders rely on going up in flames even once, let alone 5 times in the span of less than a year. But unfortunately, it's one of the risks that comes with underinvestment and a lack of actual planning for your transportation system. This moment should indeed be a rude awakening for just how bad things could indeed get for SEPTA, and it makes the push for sustainable funding solutions paramount, so that not just the status quo in Philly transit can be maintained, but so that it can get genuinely better and start to move beyond that unfortunate mediocrity that a system with bones as good as SEPTA's has been cursed with for years. Philadelphia needs great transit as one of the keys to resolve many of its issues it faces in other regards. The transit system is the circulatory system of a great city, and it needs improvements for years to resolve things from traffic problems to income inequality. SEPTA does indeed have some good ideas to make this circulatory system run to its full healthy potential. And while to me I would go far further, something that I will elaborate on more in the future, there are at least some good signs that they really want to fix these problems, but they have been constrained due to bad funding models, flawed laws and bylaws, and of course, some short-sighted decision-making from many directions, both within and without. The Silverliner 4s in the state that they are in, particularly with the fire fiasco, are just the latest example of this. However, it's not all bleak in the short and long terms. The train's inspections and new equipment for preventing these incidents will keep them together for a few years at least, and if all goes to plan, these may well be the last few years of the Silverliner 4's carry passengers, and when the Silverliner 6s arrive, which SEPTA hopes to see by the early 2030s, the Silverliner 4s will finally get the rest and dignified retirement that they deserve, and hopefully, there comes a time when I see one in a museum. For now though, they'll come back and play the role they've had for over 50 years as commuter trains, though with struggles continuing. However, there's much more hope than one may think for the regional rail network, and perhaps in a few years' time, we see a new face of Philly transit and the regional rail, which alongside the new trolleys, the new cars for the Market Frankfurt L, and even the new buses, become a reprieve for many of the riders and advocates for Philly's transit system, and can very well become the symbols of a turnaround from a rock-bottom situation for the city of Philadelphia, and how it gets around.